Hi everyone, it's Jakov, and due to a new version of Last Alliance Total War being released, I'm here to cover the newest faction added to the mod, the Kingdom of Rhovanion. If you're new here, the Last Alliance Total War is a mod for Total War Shogun 2, set in the Second Age of Middle-earth, being somewhat of a prequel timeline-wise to Total War The Dawn of Stays, a mod for Total War Attila set in the Third Age instead. As of making this video, the mod is in development, being in the version 0.4.0 alpha, currently getting closer to a full release, currently having many factions and a campaign ready to play. For those of you interested in the mod, I'm going to leave it linked in the description, and I do encourage you to play. Today's video, as I said, will be a faction breakdown with me going over the history within both the books and films of Tolkien's universe of the Kingdom of Rhovanion before looking at the civilizations that inspired it in real life. After that, I'm going to look at the faction's units and break them down, covering their battlefield roles as well as looking at their equipment and seeing how historically authentic it is. The Kingdom of Rhovanion is located in the east of Middle-earth, on the eastern side of the Misty Mountains, north of what would become Gondor and Rohan, and west of Rhûn, the region being home to elves, dwarves, and humans, a significant part of the area being vast grassland and steppes. It was here that the Northmen of Rhovanion would primarily settle, although beset by the survivors of the Dark Lord Morgoth's host after the end of the War of Wrath, they would ally themselves with the dwarves and elves, their skill with horses allowing them to complement the infantry-oriented armies of their allies. Constantly fighting against evil, these men would fight in the War of the Last Alliance, after which they would have a grand alliance with Gondor in the Third Age, much intermarriage occurring between the men of the North and the Númenóreans, although this would cause conflict in Gondor. Eventually the Kingdom of Rhovanion would fall to the Easterlings, although some survivors of this calamity would become the ancestors of the Rohirrim, who would keep the cavalry skills of their forebears. The men of Rhovanion appear in the Hobbit book and films as the men of Dale, who were their descendants, although their cavalry prowess isn't shown, and in the Lord of the Rings books and films, the closest you get to them are the Riders of Rohan and the war waged in the north by the dwarves of Erebor and their Dalian allies against Sauron's Easterlings. In terms of cultures who may have inspired the men of Rhovanion, we have the migration-era warriors of Europe such as the Saxons and the Franks, as well as the Carolingians, upon whom the aesthetic of this faction is at least appears to be based. These civilizations living mostly as very basic villages and towns, though their warriors would mostly be mounted. With the history of the faction both in and out of universe looked at, let's look at its units beginning with its generals. Unlike in the Dawn of Stays where generals can sometimes be more elite units that can be used multiple times in one army, the generals in this mod are unique, with each faction generally only having 2 generals, the Kingdom of Rhovanion also having 2 general options. The first of these general units are the Northman Company of the Marshal. Heavily armoured mounted warriors, these troops very much resemble their Rohirrim descendants. Starting with their horses, all the mounts are armoured in scale barding with their chests reinforced with gilded plate to provide extra protection. Barding was widely used to protect horses, with scale being a common form, used by the Romans, the Parthians, the Sassanids, the Cumans, and many more cultures beside, although the Anglo-Saxons who these guys are based off didn't use horses in battle, let alone barding, this armour most iconically being used by the cataphracts of antiquity. Turning to the riders, they wear exquisitely gilded helmets decorated with horses and topped with horsehair plumes, the helmets very much being based off of those used by the Anglo-Saxons, mail being attached to the helmet to provide neck protection. Turning to their body armour, they wear an arming shirt with mail sleeves over which they wear scale hauberks, a very historic armour type, on top of which they have a gilded gorget protecting the upper chest, which isn't quite so historical given that gorgets were worn under armour rather than over the top, something which has been popularised in the public image by shows such as Game of Thrones as well as the Lord of the Rings films, where this also occurs. Turning to the rest of their armour, they have plate van braces protecting their forearms, while their shins are protected by greaves, a short green cloak being worn uniformly over their backs. For shields, they use a typical round migration-era shield with a metal rim and boss, the shields being painted a mix of greens and blues, the shields being gilded with emblems of horses reflecting their cultural tie with them. For weapons, they have migration-era Viking swords at their sides, while their main weapons are spears that look straight out of the 12th century, the spears being used as lances from horseback. Looking at the unit officer, he's mostly identical to his troops, although he wears a gilded breastplate over his scale hauberk to show off his wealth and superior position. As a unit, these guys are very heavy shock cavalry who excel at breaking units and causing mayhem, though they are vulnerable to archers, enemy cavalry if bogged down, and especially spearmen who are their hard counter. Personally, I'd recommend these guys if you want a cheaper general unit who can hit like a truck and can dismount at a pinch to bolster your forces with top tier infantry. Moving on to the second general option that Rhovanion has access to, we have Tira leading the company of the First Marshal. Tira is a character invented for the mod who serves as the Duchess of one of the main regional powers of Rhovanion and the overall leader of the Rhovanion coalition. Looking at her unit, Their horses are armoured as seen previously, although the riders ought to a man now wear the gilded breastplate seen only on the officer previously, as well as gilded van braces. At their sides, the men carry what I can only describe as a migration-era bastard sword, a weapon which in reality never existed, as metallurgy at that point historically hadn't reached a point where you could forge longer weapons. Using the same shield and spear as the previous general unit, these guys are set apart by their recurve bows, which give them the ability to rain death on enemies from afar. Recurve bows were widely used historically by many steppe peoples on horseback, where their compact size made them perfect for use. However, in combination with the other arms and armour that the unit uses, it most reminds me of the recurve bows that were used by cataphracts in antiquity, who could pivot between being heavy shock cavalry and heavy archers. Looking at Tira herself, she looks almost identical to her troops, except for her helmet, which is encrusted with emeralds and has a horsehair crest atop it, similar to ancient hoplite helmets. As a unit, these guys are essentially the previous unit but with added usefulness, doubling as both shock cavalry and archers, meaning at a pinch they can boost your range potential and give you the strength to clear the field of enemy cavalry. I'd recommend them over the previous unit almost every time unless money is an issue, as their ability to fulfill multiple roles means they have uses on the open battlefield as well as sieges, not something you can always say when it comes to heavy cavalry. Altogether, a great unit that more than makes a match for the other heavy cavalry likely to be met in the mod. With these guys covered, all the generals have been looked at, so we'll move on to the regular units of the faction, beginning with axe infantry, specifically the Northman Mark infantry. Lightly armoured warriors, these troops mostly wear Norman-style helmets with crosspieces. Although some have fur caps, their bodies being protected solely by gambeson and padded textile armour that was widely used by lesser warriors. Here is an armour choice that makes a lot of sense and it's wonderful to see, being useful against slashes to a certain degree. For shields, they use wooden bucklers rimmed and embossed with metal, weapons being one-handed axes. All in all, these troops resemble light infantry from the 13th century British Isles, using older style helmets and lacking metal armour or relying on small shields and axes, axes in particular being one of the most common weapons found in medieval armies. The shields are decorated with symbols of horses, the shields very much resembling those that will be used in the future by the Rohirrim. Looking at the officer, who's equipped much the same as his men, apart from the mail hauberk he wears and the short cloak around his neck, the officer fitting of the high Middle Ages aesthetic of the lower class light infantry to a T. As a unit, these guys are a core part of your early armies, being the only real infantry you can field in early matches, able to fight rabble toe-to-toe while your cavalry quickly wins battle for you. Not a decisive unit itself, it's nonetheless an important part of your army as it sets the stage for your victory, and can be quite useful in sieges, both as disposable attackers and as a defending force. Moving on to the next unit, we have the Northman Gird Guard, who ought to a man resemble the previous unit's officer, with the exception that these troops use the larger shields we've seen before in conjunction with their axes. Looking at the unit officer, he wears a mail hauberk over which he has a scale cuirass, his arms and lower legs protected by van braces and greaves, while his helmet looks like that of the general units but less ornately patterned, having no gilding or gemstones. Looking like they're straight out of the 12th century, as a unit, these guys are for all intents and purposes the best you're going to have as a core of your infantry in mid-game and late-game army builds, which can be worrying, given that they do match up well with most equivalent units. However, professional infantry outclasses them, meaning that they're best suited to buy time for your cavalry to deploy and in sieges, where they suit the role of attacker and defender well. Essentially a beefed up version of the previous unit, I consider these guys invaluable unless a pure cavalry army is what you're going for. Moving on to the next unit and the last melee infantry the faction can field, we come to the Northman Berg Guard. Wearing the helmets seen before in conjunction with mail hauberk, scale and lamellar shirts, plate greaves and van braces, these troops set themselves apart by their weapons, two-handed Dane axes that they use to bloody effect. Leaving their shields swung over their backs so as to free up a hand for their weapon and provide protection from enemy missiles, these troops resemble the Anglo-Saxon Huscarls who fought the Normans, as well as the Varangian Guard who served the Byzantine Empire, the weapons in their hands being known to be both devastating against infantry and cavalry, reports of this weapon being able to decapitate horses in one swing existing. Looking at the officer, he is mostly identical to his troops apart from his gilded helmet and van braces, his gilded gorget also helping to set him apart. The only shock infantry that the faction has access to, these guys are superbly useful on both the open battlefield and sieges, where they can be used as the heart of an attacking army, while in sieges they can be a reserve meant to break enemy bridgeheads or be the bulk of your army when attacking, relying on their ferocity and ability to be amassed easily to cleave a path through enemies. Overall, a great unit that works well in combination with the previous one, although it should be noted that compared to the professional and ultra-elite infantry fielded by some of the other factions, they can be found lacking. With these guys covered, we'll move on to the only archer unit the faction can field, the Northman Peasant Archers. As their name suggests, these men are peasants and equipped as such, having no armour whatsoever, relying on their everyday clothes and hats for protection, having sax knives at their side for defence and general use, while their main weapons are hunting longbows, not possessing the draw weight nor range of proper war longbows. Skipping their officer with a gambus and a helmet and an axe to set him apart, these troops are your basic rabble archer unit, able to provide your armies with long-range striking power in early game armies, but being rapidly outclassed after that. The only longer-lasting use being in sieges, due to there being no better option. Overall, a unit you'll see a lot of, but not necessarily one that you'll want to see that often. Moving on to the next category of units, cavalry, we come to the first mounted unit the faction can field, the Northman Shepherds. Mostly unarmoured shepherds upon unarmoured steeds, some of these men have only fur vests and hats for protection while others have gambeson, lacking shields and only having sax knives at their side, their main weapon being the spears we saw earlier used as lances, their officer only having a helmet to distinguish him. As a unit, this will be the heart of your early game army, being the main striking force and having the bulk of your power, running circles around the enemy and charging them to death, despite being very light shot cavalry all things considered. Ultra useful at their stage of the game, given there's very little competition, they should be phased out once better horsemen become available, although as a support unit, they can be fairly useful. Moving on to the next unit, we have the Northman Frontiersmen, who are more heavily equipped, all of them wearing gambeson and some having helmets, using bucklers in conjunction with their spears, the recurve bows over their backs giving them some range power, however the unit resembling the hobblars of the Scottish Wars of Independence and the 100 Years' War, light border cavalry best suited to skirmishes and raids, skipping their officer who wears a male hauberk. As a unit, these guys have a definite step up, having the ability to shoot enemies from afar as well as charge, making them a good balance of light bow cavalry and shot cavalry, allowing them to pivot between both roles as the situation demands. A great unit, they work very well in early to mid-game armies as a core of your mounted striking power, and by extension, your army. Moving on, we come to our next unit, the Northman Furred Lancers, who are equipped identically to the geared guard, but on horseback, dropping their shields and using lancers. Skipping the officer who we've seen before, these are your mid-game lancers, the core of your army whose main goal is to overwhelm the enemy and attack them from as many angles as possible, breaking their forces through destructive charges. I said to split these guys into two groups normally, one force to hunt down and defeat your enemy cavalry, and the other to engage the bulk of the enemy host with the anti-cavalry force supporting them once the battlefield is clear of enemy horsemen, and that way you can maximise the amount of lancers you can field without having to worry about being countercharged by the enemy. Moving on, we have the Northman Furred Archers who have the same armour as the previous unit, but use axes in conjunction with bucklers, recurve bows being slung over their backs. Skipping their more heavily armoured officer, as a unit these guys are a mix of melee cavalry and bow cavalry, being able to shoot enemy forces from afar before getting stuck into them with their axes. While this means they have more flexibility than shot cavalry, they don't hit as hard and make up for it by being able to stay in the fight longer. In terms of my recommendations for this unit, it really depends on how you choose to use them. If a shot cavalry oriented army is what you're going for, then these guys are easily used in a support role. Otherwise, if you want a horde of mounted archers who can also engage in hand-to-hand fighting, they suit that purpose equally well. What this all means is that this is a great unit for mid-game army builds and will almost always see play on the open battlefield. Moving on to the next unit, the Northman Landmuster Lancers appear. A significantly more heavily armoured unit, all the horses in the unit have a scale chanfron protecting their faces while their chests are protected by a plate patral. The chanfron looking straight out of antiquity while the patral looks like it could have come from the 16th century. Turning to their riders, they're equipped identically to the Northman Burg Guards except on horseback, wielding shields and spears we've seen before, looking much like their Rohirrim descendants. Skipping their officer who's identical to the troops in the general units, these guys will make up the core of your professional armies, being the resource around which your strategy is built. When amassed together they create an iron fist which can break through almost all opposition as long as care is taken to reduce their chances of being mowed down by archers and spearmen. Overall, a unit which will see service almost constantly on the open field, though even in sieges they can be useful for both sally out attacks and as a mobile reserve within your walls. Turning to our next unit, we have the Northman Landmuster Archers, who are armoured the same as the last unit, carrying axes, bucklers and recurve bows to set them apart. As a unit, these are your professional mounted archers and should be used as such, bleeding enemy formations of strength before your heavy cavalry slam into them, serving the same role as their mid-game predecessors. The only thing that sets them apart is that they won't be required to be your regular melee cavalry, as the next unit coming up fulfills that role. That unit would be the Northman City Muster, who are almost identical to the previous two units, are set apart by their uniform gorgets and their use of swords, particularly migration era swords that wouldn't look out of place in the hands of a Viking or an Anglo-Saxon, such weapons being good cutters, which makes them well suited for use on horseback running down fleeing enemies. Skipping their officer, this unit is a typical professional melee cavalry who excel at getting stuck into enemy shock cavalry and cutting them down, being adequate at charging into enemy formations even if they are found somewhat lacking in sheer firepower. I'd recommend using these guys in a support role to catch out enemy shock and bow cavalry, reducing them from the field so your cavalry can then tear apart enemy infantry without having to fear being attacked. As such large numbers of them won't be required, the bulk of your money going straight into heavy cavalry. Moving on to the next unit, we have the Northman Company Lancers, who are essentially the general units, being heavily armed and armoured cataphracts. Serving the same role as the generals, these guys are sledgehammers who punch holes in enemy formations, and who can go toe-to-toe with the heaviest cavalry any faction can muster, an absolute must-have for late-game armies which will serve as a spear tip of your mounted forces. Moving on to the final unit that the Kingdom of Rhovanion has access to, we have the Northman Company Archers, the bow equivalent of the previous unit who used the same armour in conjunction with previously seen swords, shields and bows. As a unit, these guys are heavy archers who can endure punishment, dish it out at range and then smash into the enemy, being able to hash it out in melee. When it comes to their use, I'd say they're never really needed in any more than a limited role unless you plan on having a completely elite army. The other mounted archers more than being enough to get the job done. With these guys covered, every unit in the faction has been looked at, so let's move on to the faction as a whole. The Kingdom of Rhovanion is almost one and the same as its descendants the Rohirrim, being an almost pure cavalry faction, horses being the name of the game. As such, it's quite a breath of fresh air compared to the other factions, who are usually more balanced or tend to be infantry oriented. Well, you might think that such a focus on cavalry leads them to be shoehorned into a basic strategy. That's not true, as the faction can pivot between heavy cavalry and mounted archers, leaving room for development on the open battlefield, although in sieges they are somewhat lacking. A very unique faction. I have no doubt that Rhovanion will make for a fun experience for players, allowing them to indulge in flexibility and speed otherwise unknown till this point in the mod's development. With all that said, my breakdown of the Kingdom of Rhovanion is over, and up until a new update is released for the Last Alliance Total War, this will be my last video breaking down faction rosters, although given how quickly the amazing modders work, I don't think we'll be waiting too long for a new update. That said, I'll be back soon with new videos for both this mod and the Dawnless Days, such as battle videos and army builds. If you'd made it this far, please like and subscribe. It might not seem like much, but for such a small channel, it's massively appreciated. This is your host Jakov, signing out.